I saw you first.
Hey, Cash. I saw you first. Smell like grass, too.
Like
What did you hear? No. My mom didn't.
That was a great. Right.
Make a spot over here.
Yvonne, you're right. I wouldn't be surprised if you got it, everybody.
Hey, Cash.
I worked with the band for 8 years. They probably
After maybe your second one, if you want to have somebody lead a prayer, you can.
You know how the people that you might know sometimes.
Yeah.
Turn you to stone.
There was a girl in school. Nobody's gonna be good.
I'm patient. I know because I'm saying how to spell it.
Well, I've heard it.
A lot of people say Ybon that actually say their name. Spell it out. It's just wrong. My name was never on the book.
You know Gary very well. He's a man. He loves his father.
Take care of what's I know. It's a lot easier with school. There you go. He's trying to get that in every single time.
Brandon can teach math. And he could have research when he has to. I mean, he's an engineer.
That's what it means.
Let's go ahead and begin. If you have a songbook, turn to song number 71. Number 71. As the my soul longs after you, you alone are my heart's desire. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. And I long to worship. yours the kingdom of God, and His righteousness unto you, singing Alleluia. Ask and it shall be given unto you, singing Alleluia. Shall not live every word from the mouth of God. While we do His good will, He abides, stand, obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and not a clean drive to hear, not a sign, trust and obey. Other way, but to trust and obey. Not a burden He share, but for He doth richly cause. Not a frown nor a cross, but is blessed if we trust and obey. Trust and to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. But we never can prove till all on the altar we lay, for the favor He shows and the joy He bestows are for those who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no Jesus, but to trust and obey. Then in fellowship sweet, we will sit at His feet, or will walk by His side in the way. What He says we will do, where He sends we will go. Never fear, only obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Sorry, I forgot to ask somebody to lead the prayer. Kurt, would you do it? Thank you.
Our time together will be a time that will be strengthening for each of us and encouraging, that we will another into you. We ask that as we spend time in your word this evening, that we'll gain from our study things will help us understand better what you expect of us in this life and how we can as lights and as expressions of your love, that others will be drawn to you by the way we lead our lives. We thank you for we share in Him the offer of reconciliation to you. May we never take that for granted, but instead and really guide and even control the life that you've entrusted to us, along with everything that life entails. Sickness, or recovering from surgeries, physical circumstances of one kind or another, physical struggles, but also we pray the spiritual and psychological strength that they need to see in those struggles the opportunity to your hands and your encouragement, your service, your whatever way that we can. We also pray for those who finding their commitment to you waning in some way, and we ask that they will be turned and the eyes that can see spending these opportunities worshiping you together and sharing with each other the things that are on our hearts and minds, and indeed sharing our lives together and supporting each other. thank you for the gift of that support and that partnership as we walk together in service to you. And may we always strive to be an encouragement to you in this world. So thank you again.
Good evening.
If y'all will mark number 948.
Well, we are, I guess, almost a subsection in what we've been looking at when we've been talking about families, and then Christians having children, and then raising that last week, especially there in Ephesians, through children, but to raise them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That idea of bringing them up, nurturing that, and what I'd like to do today is kind of take some of those thoughts from even back in the marriage lessons when we looked in Ephesians chapter 5 into raising the children, and kind of bring some of those things together, because something that we've discussed is what our goal should be is thinking even generations beyond, Lord willing, if those are to be, that the next generation, the generation after that, continues on. And we can see how quickly values and teachings can get lost if they're not brought before the upcoming generation, and how difficult it is to go back to that. And so we want to be sure that we're teaching our children time for our congregation, and it doesn't necessarily they're children that have grown and I don't want to say too much, but moved on, seeing another generation probably have children of their own, and I do think it's something worth celebrating, and I'm glad that we do that here with this congregation. But it might not be surprising to you. A few weeks ago, when we talked about having children, we discussed at the beginning that our culture has shifted to have children much later. And we talked about the reason to see that marriage, more and more, a growing number, that are just not marrying and choosing not to marry. Now, Paul talks about the idea of being single and being unmarried in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8 is where we can see some of this. And yes, there is singleness mentioned in the Bible. Paul, there being one of them, and so we're not going to necessarily spend time looking through and dissecting 1 Corinthians chapter 7, but I think it is worth noting that what Paul talks about here is almost kind of the I don't know if supernatural is the idea, but the harder ability to obtain, and then what he's discussing is to, if they do marry. And so what I think is important for us is to prepare for this, and then if they end up going the way of Paul for reasons like this, then to go on into the next generation to marry, and what that looks like as they were, that we've already discussed. Going back to Genesis, we have marriage. How long is that supposed to last? Yeah, so as long as they're alive, right? As long as at least as long as both of them are alive, that marriage is to remain. And when we hear marriage is in a world where this often is not the case, and when we talk about to our children what they are and prepare them, I think it's important. So often we send our young people off to colleges, or they're unprepared to know what exactly they should. Times where the parent talks about these things, the parent points out these things as they go through their younger years, and then more specifically talks about them as they mature. But what we have is kind of muddy the waters on what to look for. So we have men now going back to our study on biblical manhood. We have men who are looking for someone that doesn't require them to be a man sometimes, and continue on in just the who are looking for a partner too that would want them to in turn act like a man in some ways, to take on those responsibilities, those roles, and to carry on burdens that aren't necessarily theirs to have, and that causes trouble from the get-go. And so we want to teach our children how to find the right spouse, and also how to train our young people to be that as well. So there is a parent involvement in all this. So let's think about even the way that we do weddings now. Okay, you have a wedding, and the way that we typically do it is the groom is up there in the front, and at some point the bride comes in, and everybody stands and looks at the bride and comes down. But who is she walking with typically? Who gives this woman? What is meant by that? Now, I know that's not necessarily like we don't have a format in the Bible of how to do a wedding, but what is meant by that? Because we'll get to, I think it is a biblical concept.
Well, she's leaving the authority of her family,
Mm-hmm.
and she's going under the authority of a new family.
Yeah.
So you're getting.
Yeah. Any other thoughts there? And it demonstrates too something about the headship in the family, right? That it's even, here it is with this young woman, and she is under her father's headship. Now when people try to keep the two last names or whatever, really they're just saying, well, I'm keeping one of, they're trying to be independent of that, and they're really just kind of keeping one of another man who had headship over them in one way or the other. Marriage. If we look in Jeremiah chapter 29, when Jeremiah is talking about how the Jews are to live when they're in Babylonian captivity, what does he tell them in regards to in marriage? And then you are to then in giving in marriage, and then that you are to give your children in marriage as well, to give your daughters in marriage, and so on and so on. So there's that idea there in the Old Testament about a giving of marriage and then having children, and we see that take place in Luke chapter 20. I guess we'll get to that in probably a few months in our study of Luke. But in Luke chapter 20, there's that idea of that question that's brought to Jesus about marriage, and he describes it as giving in marriage. And then in eternity, there's no marriage or giving in marriage, but he makes a point to point out that there's neither one of those. But here on earth, there is marriage and there is a giving in marriage, and so I think that's important for us to think about in the lens of, and kind of the lens I want us to look at it through is are we preparing our daughters so that we can give them in marriage to a good Christian man? And are we preparing our sons to be one that a good Christian father would desire to have his daughter given in marriage? It's just kind of, just maybe tradition or things like that. But but there's really something to that, and we need to think about that as far as when we're raising our children to be forward looking enough to start thinking about those things, start praying about those things, start preparing that as well. One of the prayers that I have for my kids is that there is a family out there that is preparing a spouse for them, that they are the godly fathers that we're raising our girls to be, and to seek out godly men. Any thoughts? So with this idea, we have a culture that has turned so many things, and one of the reasons why people are marrying later, I guess the sexual aspect of the marriage relationship has become something that is informal. Maybe you've seen television shows, and on these television relationship with one another, here's a big commitment that I'm thinking about telling so and so that I love them. It is on this, and that our culture has a part of the not completely, but a part of that sexual relationship is procreation. Have children without this sexual relationship that we see now, or they can they can have sexual relationship without what they would say is the consequence of children. Lately, there was a conservative, quote unquote conservative commentator who is a gay conservative, and they are having a child through a surrogate mother, and there's this whole weird kind of process, through using science and things. Conservative values coming on board and supporting this is something good, is something natural, is something that yes, we should support. And I guess I don't know where all of y'all are politically, but if that is what they say conservatism is, then I don't think I'm that. I think what we need to be is very biblical in what we do, and that keeps us from going down paths and that we can say, oh, well, I got these values over here. So when we start talking about marriage, I'll marry my daughter, and it's this idea of what type of person that man must be in order for him to give his blessing for. And so I want to go over these things, and I want us to think about training our children in this way, and also training our children to look for these things, types of men. Then we won't catch every bump along the road, but we will. That we're going to go over some things that I will say that I look at and I say I need to work on these aspects in my life, and I'm be ones who at least demonstrate these and who are willing to work on in four categories here, and priest, prophet, provider, protector is the way that of priest he describes as an individual who would have spiritual headship over his family. Turn your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 3. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman in life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. The husband to do about. Okay, yeah. So he is to honor the woman as the weaker vessel. The weaker vessel idea, right? And that whatever, and they have pushback against that. But woman, I think it puts the proper balance there. I think it shows what type of value, like in or like in Ephesians 5, that the man should have, gives her honor. He honors her as the weaker vessel. And the purpose of doing that is what? That last part of the verse. Why does Peter say that? What in the prayers not being hindered?
I think God has a design that if the husband refuses, likely to hear his prayers.
Mhm.
Because he doesn't deliberately refuses.
Along with then the praying for his family through praying for his thoughts on that.
Well, if the woman typically doesn't like this verse because it says weaker,
Mhm.
this is why the man doesn't like it, because it's virtually saying the way that we treat our wives is going to determine our spiritual relationship with God. That's kind of scary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
The weaker vessel does not apply to her mentality, it applies to the fact that she is weaker in strength.
Okay. Yeah. There is this idea of, typically physically they're weaker, but I think it's also talking too along that idea about the way that God created. God created the man to be out in the front, and we'll kind of get to some of that later on. We talk about the protector and stuff like that. But Jeannie, I think you're right though. In our typically in the past, what's been is do things for the woman that would help her in her with where she is short, and then that way she can help you as well. And so we could even go back to that Ephesians 5 study. We'll look at some of that momentarily. But yeah, you're right, Jeannie. Other thoughts there?
The way I tend to look at that situation is, because I know that's one of the most controversial. Weakness is probably not the best English word to maybe try to get that thought across. When you consider the role that the woman takes, the one of submission, is typically thought of as weaker.
Yeah.
And honor the wife of being in that role of submission. The employee or employers and things like that. And probably obviously when our employer is maybe not as smart as we think we are or something like that. And so we can kind of somewhat understand how difficult it could be for the wife as well.
Yeah.
To be in that position, and to me that is a concept not only of physical weakness, but the role of submission, and we need to honor them.
And something that you said there reminded me of the I forget the word now. Basically overbearing or
Not lording it over.
lording it over them. Yeah, lording it over them, and I think. But if we have elders that lord it over them, then need to be in shepherding that church. And so likewise, if you have a husband that's not valuing his wife as this weaker vessel, and not seeing her as he's going to get to heaven, have a little bit more inheritance than his wife, because he was the man of the house. That's not what it's about. It's about role and order in those roles. Yeah. Bringing the family to know God and to spiritual headship. Our girls should be looking for somebody who is showing and displaying faith in their life. They're displaying characteristics in their life that they take on responsibilities of things, and we'll get into Bible reading and things like that. They lay down their life for others. How do they treat others? How do they treat their parents? How do they treat their siblings? Those types of things. How do they treat their friends? Are they sacrificial to them? I just think about even this idea of taking the right things. I've maybe even taught some teen classes here, and you can look around and you can see pretty quickly. I know that sometimes they mature past it too, like I'm saying, but that should be a red flag to girls. If they never take any of that stuff that should be taken seriously serious, then are they going to be this? Are they going to take on the role of spiritual headship? seriously. Any other thoughts or comments there about spiritual headship within the family?
My note says, weaker in delegated authority,
Okay.
emotions, and strength.
Yeah. Yeah. So secondly, kind of going along with some of the things that we ended there, he needs to be take on the role of a prophet to his family, in meaning that he brings the word of God to his family. Now, again, does this say that the woman is incapable of understanding the word of God and interpreting that on her own? No. Obviously, we could say the exact opposite, that the wife does need to be in her Bible as well. But it's the man's job to bring we looked at back in Ephesians chapter 5. Verse 25 and 26. It says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with" what? Word. That's something to think about, right? Are you men in here? I think we can go back to some of these lessons that we had and go back to the men. Are we doing this in our homes? We need to spend time in it. They enjoy it. So you see that role. He starts doing this with his wife. He's going to do it with the kids as well. Yeah.
I think we may have an example too. Then tells them, if you've seen me, you see is to make the word to be as Christ was, a representation of what.
Yeah, we go along with that for sure. Tom? To show characteristics of being a provider, provide for his relatives and especially for members of his household. He has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So it is a man's duty to be the provider for his family, to provide the family with one that comes along, and the church does help, right? We see that in Acts, we see that, but the man needs to take on that role of responsibility. We also see, I think we can understand, we can distinguish with our own wisdom, with godly wisdom, what those times are. But in verse 8, he's talking about taking care of the household in the fact of taking care of who? Who's he talking about in verse 8? It'd be his mom, right? Yeah. So there's verse 11. It says, used to enroll younger widows, for their passions draw. Why should the church not provide so that they would desire to marry? Because, verse 12 it says, and so to incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith, and not only idlers, but also gossips, busybodies, saying, marry, bear children. So there's the idea of marriage and children. So in this, I'll be providing. But assumed, here I point this out just to say that it's assumed by Paul that if these women ability of the church, it should be first by the husband and then the church. To have a good work ethic and to work for as if you are working for the Lord in all that you do. So finally, we look at this idea of a protector. We can go back to that idea in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. But I like to take in Nehemiah 4 and verse 14. Nehemiah has divided now in families, and the idea is so that they would protect and to fight for the city, because they would be defending the families. And so he says, sons, your daughters, and your wives, and your homes. This idea of fighting for you're talking about this idea of finding a protection, because I have to be the one to, but Twitter or YouTube or those of you who go on those things and you see like this car coming and this guy in the situation, those things happen. Much like, but those things happening to your family, something like that. Saying, what are we allowing to come into our home? So so many times we have dads that might sit there on the TV, and what is it that they have playing? Is it something that do we know what our children, families, from those types of dangers? What dangers are out there on that? That video of that girl who was, but I was there in my room for hours at a time, and I was bringing people in from all over the world, and the dangers there. What about this? What about our dads themselves? And I don't know about you, but you know, one day maybe my daughters would rebel if I said this, but I would not give a blessing if I didn't feel like the guy that they brought was doing that. Guess what? They're gonna get a knock. That's in kids to do that, to help them from the beginning on those relationships. That we teach them that marriage is close out. Church, I want to offer you a chance to respond to that. Lingers on by the world's delights, things that are higher, things that are nobler. Come to thee, I being the student's tribe, he is the true. Friends may oppose me, foes may beset me, still will I enter in. So glad and free, Jesus.